I'd like to begin our discussion of the fast etude for Year E with a warning. Do not underestimate this etude. Compared to many of the faster etudes in the audition music prescribed for other years, and particularly for Year D, this etude is considerably easier in terms of the basic technical execution. With this greater ease, though, I would anticipate that the judges will want to hear performances that go above and beyond the notes on the page. This is always true, of course, but when the technical demands are reduced, the musical expectations are inevitably increased. Now, the only composer named Gatti, about whom I could find information on the internet, is a somewhat older contemporary of Mozart, placing him firmly in what we call the classical period. To me, though, this piece sounds more like something that might be taken from an opera from the Romantic period, so a little later than this. And maybe we're looking at a different Gatti. In any case, to get some stylistic ideas, get on YouTube or Spotify or whatever service you prefer, and look up the works of Romantic Italian opera composers like Verdi or Rossini. The tempo and style are probably slower and perhaps more majestic than an American student might think just by looking at the tempo and style markings. Now, speaking of tempo and style markings, let's define our terms. Allegro is probably familiar to you by now, it just means fast. But then we have marziale, which means played in a martial or militaristic fashion. Essentially, this is a march. And then squillante. It means resonantly, as you have marked there in brackets. The notes marked this way should be very rich and full. And that brings us to tempo. The instructions indicate that this etude should be played with a quarter note at 112 to 120 beats per minute. I tend to favor the slower end of this tempo range, as European marches tend to be slower than their American counterparts. This also helps to capture the majestic militaristic feel that is called for. Think of a parade with soldiers in full regalia, not of an occasion where troops are trying to move from one place to another as quickly as possible. With regard to rhythm, think of a double dotted sound on the dotted eighth-sixteenth patterns. In other words, you're going to play these really as a double dotted eighth note with a 32nd note. For the most part, this is a mind trick to keep you from making the dotted rhythms sound too much like triplets, which is a real danger in a piece that, in fact, has quite a few triplets. Still, if something closer to a double dotted sound comes across rather than a strictly timed dotted eighth-sixteenth pattern, this is all right. Sixth, dynamic contrast is important. This is especially true when you have the fortissimo squillante bursts followed immediately by pianissimo. Make sure that that contrast is wide and clearly heard. Even the moving staccato triplets and dotted patterns can have some dynamic shape to the lines, though. This is, again, one of the things that will set you apart from your competitors. Next, articulation. Although much of this etude is marched staccato, when moving this quickly through articulated passages, don't really try to play short. Instead, blow lots of air and tongue lightly, really allowing the tongue to ride along the airstream as if the air is propelling the tongue. This way, the staccato notes will be short enough without becoming clipped, and any tongue fatigue will be minimized. Breathing. While the breathing in this etude is relatively straightforward, I always recommend that you plan and mark your breaths. This lends consistency to your practicing and to the audition itself, and helps to prevent the negative effects of nervousness upon breathing. After all, when you practice taking deep, full breaths in the same places every time, you'll keep doing that even when the extra nerves might strike in the audition room. Ninth, long notes. With so much movement and staccato markings, it might be easy to overlook the presence of longer notes or otherwise to cheat them of their full value. This is unfortunate, especially since the longer notes are often the most important ones in the phrase. Make sure that quarter notes, half notes, and sometimes even dotted eighth notes receive their full length. This helps to create that necessary emphasis, and also demonstrates a certain maturity, since young players are often prone to shorten longer notes, particularly quarter notes. Finally, Don't overemphasize the grace note in the sixth line. Low brass players, maybe particularly trombone players, tend to make one of two errors regarding grace notes and other ornaments. They'll either skip them, which is a problem, or overemphasize them in an apparent bid to prove to themselves and others that low brass players can do ornaments too. Both of these extremes are errors. Ornaments are decorations only. To employ one of my favorite analogies, ornaments are neither cake nor icing. They're sprinkles, which add only a bit of interest and don't really change the nature of the cake in any significant way. And yet, if too many sprinkles are added, they can spoil the treat. Make sure that the grace note is there and that it occurs just before the downbeat, but don't overdo it. The emphasis is on the real note, the concert G flat. This particular example is a little easier to execute on the euphonium and tuba than on the trombone. But in either case, if you have a good idea of the desired sound, you should be able to achieve the right result as long as you don't overthink it.